Good morning, friends. In Sunday's message, we saw how Jesus was confronted by the religious leaders of Jerusalem, demanding that he answer their questions. Instead of doing that, however, he put a question back to them that forced them to either confront the truth head on or to feign ignorance to get out of being trapped by that truth. And this led us to the conclusion that the unbelieving person who demands to remain in their unbelief, well, that just demonstrates that regardless of anything else they say, they do not actually care about the truth. They don't care about reality. They simply care about maintaining their own perspective because that's what justifies them living as they do. To bring this into a very common modern context, we have those opponents of biblical truth who dismiss the reality that we live in. They suppress the truth of God's very existence so that they can maintain their perspective that there is no such thing as an absolute standard, therefore there could be no judge, and when we die, we simply wink out of existence. Therefore, no standard, no judge, no judgment. No need to worry about your current lifestyle, the way you think or act, because these things are not going to impact eternity because there is no eternity for you. You will simply cease to be. So nothing you do now is going to impact anything else except for this short span of life you have now, which means you can live however you want to live without any fear of ultimate judgment, no fear of being held responsible for your actions. And this is fundamentally the primary reason why there has been such a concerted effort in the world at large to explain our existence, why the world is the way that it is, how we came to be here, without having to rely on a creator God. There's other things that play into this, obviously, but a big one is when Darwinian theory, or the Darwinian theory of evolution, really took hold. And I know that sometimes people believe it. Well, Darwin wasn't the first one. No, I get that Darwin wasn't the first one to think about evolution, but he's certainly the one who popularized it. And when it took hold, there was this cry of jubilation amongst all those who were looking for a way to get out from underneath the authority of God. And the sentiment went something like this. They said, we no longer need to be beholden to all of these myths of divine beings and a God who will judge us. We once couldn't explain how things work. We couldn't explain the world around us other than to say God did it. But now we understand everything from where the lightning comes from to where life came from. So we no longer need God. And so as good and as useful and even as God-honoring as what scientific endeavors can be, many people used science, or what I would actually prefer to call pseudoscience, to then justify the notion that God does not exist because we found a supposedly scientific explanation for creation that does not actually require a creator. But as I mentioned on Sunday, there are questions that can be asked, and I believe must be asked, like in Jesus' situation with the chief priests and the elders, questions that we can put back on these staunch opponents, which, if properly and honestly examined, would demand that these people come face to face with the truth of God's existence as creator and therefore moral lawgiver, which means there is this idea of being held to God's standard and therefore being judged according to that, which of course leads to the gospel or the need of the gospel, which is what we're all about trying to communicate to the world. But if people are not willing to come face to face with that, even as the religious leaders that were facing Jesus, they were not willing to come face to face with the answer to the question that he asked, well, then they are going to simply feign ignorance. Even though the true answer to the question is blatantly obvious, in an attempt to just avoid it, they will just act in ignorance. And I promise I'd give you some questions that could be put back on that skeptic. Now, again, I'll say this again a little bit later, but these are not mic drop questions. They are not gotcha questions, simply because, as we just said, it doesn't mean the person is automatically going to believe because you ask it, because they can default to that ignorance. But I did want to give you some of the questions that you can ask and hopefully get a good conversation if the Lord is going to work in that situation, work in that person. And of course, it's not just these questions, but you add the gospel as well. You bring the people the truths of scriptures, not just, these kind of logical arguments. But in this idea of people are saying God doesn't even exist, we don't need God. Well, there's a couple of questions that we can ask them. Questions like, well, how does chaos produce order? How does life come out of non-life? How does irrationality and purposelessness actually produce and give rise to rationality and purposefulness? You see, in order to get rid of God, people have to deny any purpose in creation. In the current secular mindset, what we have today is simply the product of random, chaotic, purposeless forces. That's the claim. And then there's also the safeguard of saying, well, this does seem like a tricky thing, but with enough time, anything is possible. But again, we need to base this in logic. Okay, what is logic? Or how does logic play in here just at this level? Because the idea with enough time, anything's possible. That's why random, chaotic, purposeless forces can do this. But we can't abandon logic at the first step, because if something is impossible, by definition, it can't happen, regardless of how much time is involved, regardless of how many iterations of the universe you might claim exist. If something is impossible, it cannot happen, regardless of any other factors. But they will say, yes, this seems impossible, and logically, it is impossible. But with enough time, the impossible becomes possible. No, that's not how it works, logically speaking. Think about it. For instance, it is impossible for chaos to produce order, because by the very nature of chaos, it's chaos, which is the opposite of order. So by the very nature of the thing, it cannot produce anything other than what it is. Chaos cannot produce order. But we clearly live in an ordered universe. That's the only way we can have things like Newton's laws of motion. That's the only way we can have any laws of physics, any of what we call the laws of nature, because things behave in a certain ordered, predictable way. And this is actually what allows science to be a thing in the first place, because science is all about observing something long enough that you can start describing how that thing works so that you can make increasingly accurate predictions about what will happen next based on the fact that it's an ordered system. And therefore, and as a result, not only can you predict what will happen next after enough observations, but then you could say, well, I think I can predict what will happen if I insert this into the equation, if I try this, okay? This is science, and it's all based on the ordered nature of the universe, okay? The universe is full of order. And yet there are those, call them scientists, secular, whatever that you want to talk, who in an attempt to escape a creator actually undermine their own discipline by claiming that in the beginning all was chaos. All the laws of physics and all the laws of logic just were broke. They all broke down, didn't even exist. But then okay, so how does chaos give rise to order without being ordered by some higher purposeful force? Because as we already said, chaos can only be chaos by its very nature. It will remain chaos unless acted upon by something that purposes to bring order as God did. The same thing goes with rationality, or with what we call the mind. The claim is out there that all that exists in the universe today is the material realm, just the physical stuff. All we have is matter in motion. It's just chemicals and chemicals reacting together. But this notion, despite how very widespread it is, actually falls apart immediately upon any inspection whatsoever, because we can demonstrate right here, right now, that there is far more, even in our own experience to this world, than just the material physical realm. In fact, we rely on things outside the material realm in order to observe the material realm, in order to do science. Think about numbers. Numbers are not material physical things. They're not made up of chemicals. They do not obey the laws of physics. Now, yes, you can have a painted wooden number 1 sitting on a bookshelf, as you might find in a primary school classroom. But that physical piece of wood is not the number 1. It is a physical representation. It is a physical symbol of the number 1. But the number 1 itself is a concept. It is a mental concept. Numbers are conceptual. They belong not to the material realm. They exist in the realm of the mind, of concepts. And if, as is claimed, all that exists is the material realm, then how do concepts exist? How do thoughts exist? How does information exist? All of which belongs to the realm of the mind. Information, as I just mentioned, does not belong to the material realm either. Information belongs to the mind, and information is by its very nature purposeful. If it's chaotic, it's not information, because information communicates something on purpose. So the claim is that it was all chaos in the beginning, and yet we witness a world of order. It was claimed that there was no purpose, that it's all just physical stuff, and yet we witness in ourselves a drive for purpose, the assumption of purpose, and that we know that there's more than just the material realm. There is the realm of the mind, of thought, of concepts, okay? And there are so many more questions we can ask. But the incredible thing about this is that science itself, done correctly, actually does point us to the truth of these questions. Because as we learned from that Romans 1 passage, the problem is that we don't have enough to observe. The problem is that we suppress the truth of what we do observe. Every important part of reality, including the existence of God and his eternal power and divine character, it's all plain to see. It's all plain to see in what can be observed. Okay? So when it comes right down to it, actual science does point to the truth of God's existence as creator of all. We observe order in the universe. There had to be something to bring that order, bring things to order. Because again, forgive me kind of backtracking now, but we agree as Christians, we agree that in the beginning it was all chaos. The Bible tells us it was all chaos, because when God created the heavens and the earth, he created all the stuff. We're told that it was formless and void, meaning chaotic and unsuitable for life. But God created it ex nihilo in that initial state to then demonstrate how he, the God of order, brings as powerful to bring order out of chaos according to his good purpose. And of course, we see the results of that. We see the drive for purpose in our own lives. We see it throughout human history. But again, if we're all just evolved pond scum, where would a drive for purpose come from? There would be no purpose, because there is literally no purpose of even existing. We're all just an accident, as if that were possible. But we do have a drive for purpose because God created us for a purpose, which is exactly why we see so many people trying to find a purpose, and why despair is so common when people feel they have no purpose. And of course, I keep on saying once again, purpose one way or the other doesn't matter if we don't have a mind. So where do our minds come from? Where does information come from? Where does rationality come from? We're told everything started as purposeless, random, purely physical, purely just chemical reactions, but none of that can produce a mind. None of that can produce concepts. All of this, all of what we actually see, especially in terms of information and the mind, it requires a first cause, which is itself a mind, which itself has purpose, and that is God. Now, obviously, I could go on, but for the sake of time, I won't. But please don't, again, misunderstand my intention here. I'm not saying go out and ask these questions of the staunch skeptic in your family and then expect for them to immediately fall on their knees and admit how they've always been wrong or anything like that. Now, pray for them. Pray for them, and perhaps the Lord can use questions like these, asked honestly, asked with compassion, asked not belligerently, but with some humility. Maybe the Lord can use these if He desires to bring conviction in the power of the Holy Spirit to start them thinking about the answers to these questions and perhaps even submitting to the actual answers to these questions by the grace of God. That'd be awesome, and we pray for that. But these, again, are not intended to be gotcha questions that you can pull out to win the argument. But they are intended to be questions you can ask that will hopefully cause that person to think. But remember, as demonstrated in Matthew 21 with Jesus and the religious leaders, yes, if God's working on a person, then maybe that'll happen. But that person might also simply react in ignorance, saying things that just don't make sense, doubling back and contradicting themselves, defying the very logic that they say they base their understanding of the world on. But they do it because they'd rather remain in ignorance than come face to face with or submit to the truth. In either case, the questions are worth asking. With that, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.